everyone hear me okay? Great, great. Well, I don't have any magic tricks this morning, so I'm sorry. But I do have a few stories to tell you. And the first is about when I first came to OSU. So I came here about 5 years ago, and on my first day, I was asked to attend a public hearing. As it turns out, about a year prior to me arriving at OSU, OSU had just established a National Historic District on campus. It encompassed about 180 acres. And that evening of my first day at work at OSU, the Linus Pauling Institute was being considered by the Historic Resources Commission. So this was the first building that was going to be considered by that body on campus. And this is me here. And so I went to the meeting that night, again, my first day at work, and the HRC reviewed the materials. They had some concerns about the project, and they actually recommended denial of the project. So the next day I went into work, and the executive director who I was working with at the time came to me and said, "It's not a good situation." And what he said was that he was instrumental in actually getting the OSU Historic District established. And so he was on the hot seat because obviously there was a concern here that there was a project that was pretty significant to OSU. This was an institute that was moving from the Bay Area up to OSU to have a significant presence here to conduct research and things like that. And they were seriously concerned as to whether or not it was going to happen or not. So I was given the task of appealing the project to the city council and taking it before them in the hopes that we would get approval. So we made some modifications to the building. This is the design of the building as you might see it from 30th Street. The biggest concern was moving the building away from 30th Street. So it's a fairly large building. It was fairly close to the street. We pulled the building back 25 feet. We made some modifications to the building entrances, the window treatments, and some things like that. Initially, the city council made a motion to deny the project. That vote didn't carry, fortunately. There was a second motion to approve the project, and it was approved on a 5-4 vote, so it was really close. So I felt good about that. But about a month later, there was a groundbreaking ceremony, and Linus Pauling Jr. was in attendance, and he testified or spoke to what this building would mean for the community, but more importantly, for humanity. And at his testimony really struck me, and how it struck me is that inside that building, the things that occur there, the research that occurs there to deal with health and well-being of human beings and cures for cancer and things like that, that's the thing that's important. And so as I look at this building today, and being a survivor of stage 4 cancer myself, I have an appreciation for, again, some of the things that are conducted inside this building. So I look at the building, I don't really pay attention to the details of the outside and where it's located and the window treatments and things like that. What's important is what goes on inside the building. And that's something that is really significant throughout OSU. And many people don't realize that about what happens at this institution and the amount of research that goes on and the breakthroughs, whether it's nanotechnology, whether it's dealing with global temperatures or all those kinds of things. There's just an amazing amount of things that happen here, which really make it a great place to work. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about OSU, and OSU does have an interesting history. In 1859, the first Corvallis College building was constructed on campus. At that time, the population in Corvallis was 531 people. About 10 years later, Corvallis College became a land-grant institution. And in 1890, the college became Oregon Agricultural College. For the first 40 years, Oregon Ag College grew to about 400 students, or roughly 100 students per decade. And then following World War I, there was a notable increase in enrollment and new building construction, as you can see on this slide. Back here. And so in 1909, the first master plan was developed by the famous Olmsted brothers. They're also the organization, the group that did Central Park in New York City. In 1929, during the Great Depression, there was another increase in enrollment. and the growth continued following World War II. In 1939, the Corvallis College became the Oregon State College. Not Oregon State University, but Oregon State College. From the mid-40s to the mid-70s, a number of new buildings were constructed. The 60s saw a significant increase in enrollment. In the early 80s, when I attended OSU, Oregon experienced a timber recession, and enrollment decreased for about a period of about 15 years, as you can see on the slide. Then the mid-90s, enrollment began increasing again. We've also seen an increase in new building construction over the past 5 years, especially if you see what it looks like on this slide with the number of buildings identified. And this year alone, in 2014, we're slated to open 8 new buildings, which is more than we've ever done on campus here. Today, enrollment is just over 24,000, which doesn't include the Bend campus and E-campus. So I have a series of slides for you that really kind of show you some of the trending that has occurred, some of the statistics with regard to OSU, and it deals with the past 5 years and also looks at projections for the future as well. So the OSU Into program for international students grew by 13% this year. International student enrollment has tripled over the past 5 years to nearly 3,000 students. The vast majority of international students are from China. 10% of the total student body are now international students, and 21% of the students are U.S. minorities. The school with the highest enrollment here at OSU is engineering. Engineering is currently seeing the highest growth rates as well. The average high school GPA for entering freshmen is 3.57. If today's entrance standards were in place when I applied to OSU 35 years ago, I doubt I would be accepted. So sometimes being old isn't such a bad thing. Business administration is the most common undergraduate degree issued here at OSU. OSU has seen a steady increase in staffing over the past 5 years. However, in the last few years, there has been a decrease in temporary staffing. OSU's enrollment is now the largest of any Oregon university. Enrollment this year increased 5.8%. However, the campus headcount increased only 4%, and that was primarily a result of the significant increase we've seen for both E-campus and the Cascade campus. So our Cascade campus enrollment this year increased 16.9%, and our E-campus increased 18.6%. So we saw the greatest growth rate in the E-campus sign-ups, essentially. And we look out into the future, we rely on the Oregon University system, at least we do for another 4 months, I think, until we kind of divest ourselves from that. But they provide us with statistics dealing with graduation rates from students from high school, what's happening with the surrounding states, and what we are likely to anticipate in terms of anticipated growth. And so when we look at those numbers, you can see here that the enrollment projections for this year, we're still having an increase. So again, there's roughly a 4.6% increase last year, or this year, it drops to 2.9, then 2.1. And actually in about 6 years, it generally flattens out. So we're seeing that kind of plateau and that cap out, and that's fairly consistent too with what President Ray has shared with the community, and that is that he envisions that the community will in fact, or the OSU population, will have a cap rate of somewhere around 28,000 students, and right now we're just about 24. So we have capacity for about another 4,000. And it's interesting when you hear the reasoning behind that. It's not so much the pressure from the community, that's a factor that's involved. But more importantly, it has to do with what OSU can accommodate and what it can provide. And if we want to maintain a campus that is a walkable campus, in other words, the students can go between class, between the 10-minute breaks that are available, it has to be compact and relatively small. We get too large, and essentially things have to change up. You have to have a secondary campus or things like that. So 28,000 is about the number that seems to be the most comfortable in terms of what we're dealing with here. So I've got another story for you. This aerial photograph is Moreland Hall. And for those of you who know campus, I'll try and give you some descriptions here. So Moreland Hall, this is 26th Street, this is Jefferson, and this is I guess I'll say the east wing of Weatherford Hall. And in 2007, OSU made a commitment to reconstruct the 4 cultural centers that we have on campus. So we have a Native American Cultural Center, we have a Cesar Chavez Cultural Center, Asian Pacific Cultural Center, and a Black Cultural Center. And they typically occupied older buildings. In the case of the Native American Cultural Center, they occupied an old Quonset hut that was brought here in the 30s and placed here temporarily to accommodate the post-war expansion that occurred on campus. And so, anyways, the campus community said we were going to provide funding for some new facilities on campus, and it was pretty exciting for the communities themselves. So in planning, we work directly with those groups, and the first thing they need to do is identify a site for the new facility. And in this case, Moreland Hall occupied the prominent area of the site here, and this building was right up against the street. So we had looked to essentially remove the old Quonset hut and not put something back in there because there really wasn't sufficient room. And so the community really felt that they liked their centralized presence on campus and the location that they were. It was right across from the MU and very central to the core of campus. And so what they looked at is the parking lot that was right behind Moreland. There was a parking lot here that had roughly 20 parking spaces. In the old days, actually, in that time, there was actually another smaller Quonset hut that was located back here as well, and then a stand of trees to the south. So they identified the site. They actually had a shaman come down, and they did a sacred blessing on the site, which was fairly traditional for Native American communities. And then about a year later, they began the process of looking at developing and crafting a development plan and a design. Well, it came to our attention that a few years prior, the city had conducted a natural features inventory. And through that natural features inventory, they identified significant natural features. And one of those significant natural features on OSU's campus were stands of significant vegetation. And in this case, Moreland Hall historically was occupied by the forestry department. And there was a stand of property down to the south that over the years the forestry department and professors had planted trees on. And so it became kind of the forestry's arboretum, or kind of their experimental area for showing off what kind of plants could grow here in the trees and things like that. And so through the city's inventory process, it was just over a half an acre, so it qualified as for consideration. And because of its location, the city identified this stand of trees right here as highly protected significant vegetation, which means that you really can't do a whole lot within that area. That's usually not a problem, but the problem came up because actually the trees were kind of at the edge of the parking lot here, and the parking lot was in an open area. Problem was when the city had a consultant do the inventory, they did it on a sunny day, and they did it early enough in the season to where the trees that are here cast a large shadow to the north, a 60-foot shadow, actually, to the extent that it went all the way to the building, to Moreland Hall. So suddenly, the site that they had identified here for their new facility was encumbered by these highly protected significant vegetation. And we went to the city, and the city essentially said, sorry, you can replace asphalt with asphalt, and in this case here, and the building that was here that was actually had already been removed, and you could put a building in where a building was, but you can't interchange the two. And it became very problematic for us because we said, well, we really want to put a building in this area here. So the small Quonset hut that was here was about 1,200 square feet. The building that the Cultural Center wanted to build was about 3,500 square feet, considerably larger. So it put us in an awkward spot, and especially given the fact that we were in a place where we might have to go back to the Native American group in the community here and say, guess what? We're going to have you move yet again. And there's a history of that throughout this country that we didn't want to have to bring that up again and deal with that. So it was our objective and goal to do whatever we could to make sure that the Native American community got a cultural center in that location. So I was again tasked with looking into what needed to be done. And what the city allows for is they allow for a director's interpretation. So what that means is that if you see things differently than the city does in terms of how they interpret their code, you're allowed to actually make a case, you file an application fee, And if you're successful at making that case, then they're willing to make an interpretation that would apply to you and anyone else in the community as well. And so actually, in looking through the code, I was able to determine that actually asphalt and buildings were both defined as structures. And if you look at how the language was in the code, that actually it spoke to existing structures could be replaced. So we made the case that they were in fact interchangeable. And when we submitted that to the city, we were lucky enough to actually get approval, or at least they concurred with our interpretation, and the project was able to move forward as we had hoped. And here is the actual final design. So the light green area here is the highly protected vegetation. This area here that is red are the areas that we could in fact develop within. And so again, it was paved areas, it was walkways, and it was also where existing buildings were. And then here is the outline of the building itself, and then there's some paved areas around it as well. And actually we had, so again, none of the trees were removed as part of this project. So we kept all the existing trees that were there, and we just placed the building within what was once a parking lot and is now the facility. And here's a photograph of the facility as well. Now, as you can see, one other thing that was interesting is this building, it's within the Historic District too. Now, you look at the building next to it, it's a red traditional kind of colonial building, and we have a Native American longhouse that we had to put here. And I'd share that story with you, but we were successful at getting before the HRC and getting that approved, fortunately. But that's a story for another day. I'd like to now talk a little bit about some of the projects that are currently underway. They're going to be opening fairly soon. The first of which is Austin Business Center. This is a 100,000 square foot facility that will house a school of business. It's slated to open this fall. Next is a classroom building. This building, actually, the footprint of this building is as large as a football field. It's substantial. Even though it appears as if it's a 4-story building, it's actually about 6 because of the floor-to-ceiling heights on some of the rooms. So one of the classrooms in this building will accommodate 600 individuals. It's huge. It's big. In fact, the facility itself will have about 2,300 seats. It'll be a state-of-the-art general-purpose classroom. In fact, when it is opened in 2015, there will probably be nothing like it in the state and probably in the country. So we took cues from other institutions and other universities that have some cutting-edge classroom facilities. The challenge here at OSU is we have, well, with the growth that we've seen recently, we have been, I guess I'll say, to some degree, we haven't had sufficient classrooms on campus to teach the students that are here. But more importantly, the classrooms that we do have not been upgraded in a considerable amount of time. So they're in need of being upgraded. So this will provide a huge amenity for the professors and for the students in the learning environment here on campus. As many of you may know, there has been concerns about housing in the community. And there's been concerns that OSU has not been providing their fair share of the housing stock, especially to accommodate the students. So President Ed Ray last year made a commitment to construct a new student residence. It's under construction right now. It'll have 324 beds, and that will be open and occupied this fall as well. And then lastly is a student experience center. This is going in where the parking lot was adjacent to the Memorial Union. It is intended for students primarily. And between this facility and the MU building, or where the bookstore used to be, you might be able to see it here, there's a glass canopy. And that canopy will accommodate outdoor activities. So in the past, oftentimes you would see a lot of tents set up in the MU, either during rainy days or on sunny days for events and activities and things like that. This glass canopy will accommodate a number of those events and activities so they won't have to constantly bring those tents out and take them down and break them down. So lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the campus master plan. So OSU is regulated by the city of Corvallis, and in the sense that we have a master plan that's in place. It's a 10-year planning horizon. and it allows OSU to develop within certain parameters over a 10-year period. And that current plan expires in 2015, so just under 2 years from now. So we're in the beginning processes of looking at updating that plan and crafting a new one for the city's consideration that will be from 2015 to 2025. Some of the differences are, as I showed you early on in those slides with regard to the amount of construction that has happened on campus, that has been essentially a building boom. We haven't seen that kind of construction activity and that number of new buildings on campus, I don't think ever in the history of OSU. And how we see the future playing out is that the majority of any new buildings that will be constructed on campus will primarily be driven by donors. So historically, we have had funding from the legislature, but that funding has continued to decrease over the years, and we don't see that coming back in the future at all. And so again, we envision that for those new buildings, and there will be some, but again, not nearly as many as we've seen in the past, but those new buildings will be primarily driven by donor funding. Secondly, another important thing is that we have the majority of the building stock on OSU's campus is over 60 years old. And again, there has been deferred maintenance issues which are huge, whether a lot of times it just has to do with the technology or the facility itself and the HVAC systems and things like that just need to be upgraded. So one thing we're looking at doing, a lot of money will be reinvested in those buildings and upgrading those buildings to, again, 21st century state-of-the-art so they can accommodate whatever the needs are. So some of those will continue to be used for what they have been used. Other ones will be adaptively reused, repurposed for, again, whatever the needs are for the future. And so with that, I think that's it. We've been here for 150 years. We're excited about doing what we do here. I think it's a huge amenity to this community for OSU being here. I think that OSU would be considerably different if, in fact, Corvallis would be considerably different if OSU wasn't here. So again, thank you for your time.